Once again, welcome to the Equilibrium. My name, as always, is Dan Ayebale, and here we come again to give you a dose of your economics like we do it every week. Today, it is as always as I host my usual suspects, my visitors right here on the Equilibrium. Last week we discussed about the opportunities that came up with the COVID-19 pandemic, and we came out with a few that we highlighted. If you watched the previous episode, you probably know about what we talked about, and you picked 1 or 2 points, and maybe you're already implementing. So we may not want to go back to last week's episode and maybe doing a recap. No, we won't do that. But of course, if you can check out our YouTube channel, you'll be able to view our videos from the very first one up to the last one last week, when we discussed the opportunities that arose from the rather dark COVID-19 pandemic era. Right now, today, we come back with almost something related. We talked about opportunities, but we know right now we have to talk about what Uganda has done throughout this COVID-19 pandemic, and as far as resources. Call it resources. I'm not an Englishman, but either of the two words works. Resources, yeah, any of the two. But we shall talk about resource allocation, we shall talk about resource mobilization, and of course, how the government has spent these resources. I mean, how the government has really spent government behavior in this COVID-19 era. To take you to my panelists, as usual, very smartly dressed today. It's kind of uniform, blue, and I see white. So, but we didn't plan this. It so happened. So that's the chemistry that is growing here at the Equilibrium, and you don't want to miss out on what happens here every week. Let's start over from the gentleman on the far left. To remind you his name, by now I know you are maybe well versed with his name or the names of all my guests, because now we are family. He's called Francis Mohile, yeah, and he's an economist, and he's a CEO of one of the companies around, fast-growing companies in economics, and he's also a lecturer at Makerere University Business School. Next to him is Darius Mugabe, and he's also lecturing here at Makerere University Business School, and he's also a very experienced economist, very well grounded with the economy and all that is involved with economics. Last but not least, ladies are always first, but today I want to make it special. They're last, but save the last for the what? For the best. Christine Masibo, who is also an economist and a banker. And back to me, my name is Dan Ayebale, to take you through this session, thrilling session. Don't you blink an eye, or don't you think about leaving this video before finishing it up to the end. Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we always have these notifications on your phone when we upload a new video. And of course, we move together as we try to make this world and this Uganda a better place to live in economically. So let's go down to what has brought us here. My dear guests, we've had a good time here before, and I'm very sure that today we shall have a good time as well, as we discuss what it is for the economy in Uganda. And today we are to discuss about resource allocation, resource mobilization, and especially in this COVID-19 pandemic. We all remember when the government when the COVID-19 pandemic hit us, we had very many donations, for example, coming in. We had very many people giving in tons, whatever it is. No, English is not my motherland. Someone said so. Yes. We had a lot of resources being given in. We had a lot of donations. We had a lot of aid. And we had a lot of loans that the government really got in the name of mitigating this COVID-19 pandemic. And today, I want us to go in detail about that topic and see, at the end of this day, at the end of this show, if we can come out with recommendations, or if we can come up with what we think we could have done better, and maybe giving the kudos to those who really did good, and of course, thanking them for the job well done. Let me start with Darius. We remember a lot of resources were collected. I remember the Prime Minister almost on every address used to read those donations before we go into the loans and stuff, but the donations locally that were given out by very many companies and very many organizations in the name of clamping this COVID-19 pandemic and maybe mitigating it, if you could want to use that word. We all know the figures. Maybe we could remind the viewer about the figures, but do you think from then up to now, we've really had been given, I mean, we've got the accountability, we've been told, we know, I mean, every Ugandan knows that people gave out the money, people gave out the resources, but yes, they were put the right use.
Thank you, Dan. The first point is really to point to the fact that globally or elsewhere in the world, countries are faced with the fiscal constraints. We are living in a time where countries are faced with a fiscal stress. And by fiscal stress, I mean that we have a lot to spend on vis-a-vis the resources that we have to spend. And usually that creates some kind of deficit. The very fact why you're pointing to those resources that were collected relates to the fact that it was a fiscal stress. We didn't have money to meet to mitigate the impacts of that COVID-19. And in some countries, I do think that it has reached the worst situations in as far as history is concerned. In as far as resource mobilization is concerned, and the scale, the economic scale of this pandemic, I think we still need more. The 176 billion that we did collect, it is still little money. And if I may take you to the figures, in the last financial year, we collected around 20.9 trillion Ugandan shillings, and we had an expenditure of about 40.5 trillion Ugandan shillings. That's already creating a deficit of about 19 trillion Ugandan shillings. And then COVID-19 comes in with already that fiscal stress, because that violates the golden rule of government spending. In fiscal policy, there is that golden rule which ideally says countries should spend what they collect, what they mobilize. And countries should only borrow if they are to, spend on investments, on programs that will benefit future generations. But now we are already facing that deficit. The pandemic has come in, bringing other fiscal constraints. So the issue is that we need more money.
Maybe before you talk about needing more money, the question here is, we can go there after, but if you could go to the communities, I mean to every person around, or maybe the responsible organizations, do you feel, because this is a pandemic, and ideally, we've already said, people to follow guidelines, if you tell a person to stay home, if you tell a person to maybe close their business and stay home, they need to trust you that you're telling them to do that because you're doing the right thing. So my question is, before you go anywhere, are people trusting that these donations, maybe let's talk about the locally organized resources, are people confident that they are being used in the right way?
Thank you, Dan. I again think globally the trust levels in leadership and institutions have gone low, Uganda inclusive. If you look at the trust index for Uganda, I think Ugandans no longer trust the institutions that do govern some of these activities. And lack of trust relates much to this kind of social contract that citizens have with the government. The social contract is government is supposed to mobilize resources, then spend on some services, public services, where I myself as an individual cannot meet the initial requirement to, provide that kind of service. Issues relating to health, for example, you can't leave it to myself. I can't set up a hospital. I cannot construct a road myself. Then government needs to come in. So that breach of social contract relates much on how government has been spending that money. You collect the money, but you're spending it wrongly.
All right, we shall get back to you. Let's cross over to Francis Mohili. And there are hints about our resources not being enough. Maybe we could have had more. What really hinders Uganda in general, what really hinders Uganda in as far as resource mobilization is concerned? What are the hindrances? What can we do better?
Thank you, Dan. And I greet our viewers out there. Well, Uganda, I will assure you that our problem in Uganda is not about resources. It's about how we use these resources, how we allocate resources. But because resources will never be in print, they'll always be scarce. So the question is, how are you allocating these resources? Are you allocating them efficiently, or you're doing the opposite? I was happy. The president came out and initiated that national COVID-19 relief task force. Requesting the public and all the companies, to donate, in order to mitigate the COVID-19 socio-economic consequences. So I was happy, but not surprised to see that the public embraced that initiative. People at with different capacities came in and contributed their donations. You saw a gentleman who actually earns a living by fetching water. He contributed 5,000, and he's a true citizen of this nation. A lot of people contributed money. Even we saw big, small companies all contributing. In fact, because this initiative was launched in April, and by June, it had actually collected over 31 billion Ugandan shillings, which was a good thing. This indicates that, in fact, Ugandans, they have no problem, let's say, giving to the government, because as Darius has hinted, the government and the public, there is that social contract. So whether it is through taxes, that was an indicator that Ugandans have no problem giving money or entrusting money or their resources to the government. Of course, the only challenge is that it did not take 3 months to see a headline in the newspaper saying that the COVID-19 donations had disappeared, and we are yet to see more of that. So, but I saw the government, trying, to mobilize resources from different sources, as I've said, from the domestic economy, and we also got, sources of funds from the foreign funding sources. We saw donations and grants from foreign embassies, UN agencies, and other partners, which actually amounted to $1.1 billion. And as if that wasn't enough, because the government, was anticipating that there's going to be a socio-economic, impact on the economy. So I saw IMF in June giving us a loan. I think it was at the tune of $400 million. Then in June, we got another loan from World Bank, and then also got 30 billion from African Development Fund, and that is just from the borrowing, which amounted up to 822 billion. Million US. So that is it's a lot of money, 822 million US in borrowing. But most of these loans actually are non-concession, meaning that the interest rate is above the market, price. And actually the grace period is short compared to, as opposed to, concession loans. So, but what did that indicate? Because already Uganda, we were already, even before the COVID-19, we're already in a debit crisis. Our debts are huge. By the end of last year, 2019, our debt GDP ratio was at 40%. But in just 6 months, our debt GDP ratio has grown from 40% to 49%. And we haven't finished 2020, it is still here. And more loans actually in the process. So those would be enough resources to solve these immediate issues. In fact, when we look at these, at the application, the justification for these loans, especially the ones we got from IMF and World Bank, were actually to mitigate the short and mid-term impact. So the question is, talking about, let's say, the safety nets, which is actually immediate. People were locked at home for 6 months, yeah? And you gave them food which can only last for 10 days. Does that make sense? No. And yet you got actually a loan in the name of borrowing so that you can actually provide these safety nets to the public. That is something we should look at.
Yes, we shall talk about allocation later, but I want to understand. There are two statements which I feel are maybe contradictory between you and Darius. Darius says that was not enough. You say we have more than enough. Which is which?
Yes, of course, I don't agree with Darius.
Okay.
Because I assure you that the problem with Uganda is not that we don't have resources. The problem is how do we maximize or how do we allocate or use our resources? I mean, Darius will agree with me that resources will never be in plenty. Resources are in scarcity. So the question is, how do you maximally, utilize the resources you have?
Let's have Darius make his case as well.
Thank you.
And then we can come over to Christian.
I think he has already given you the answer, that resources are never enough.
So you concede?
No, he has conceded that actually we don't have enough. Resources are still scarce. Because I already told you about the deficit that we have. We are collecting 20.9 trillion. We want to spend 40.5 trillion. That's already an indication that there is scarcity. And this scarcity has been amplified or elevated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you look at the economic magnitude of that pandemic, it requires a lot. 820 billion shillings cannot meet these health-related issues that COVID-19 presents.
All right, Francis says we have enough. The problem is allocation. You say
no, maybe the point is
no. You will make your point, of course. But as far as I can remember, you said when I asked you this question about how we can really improve our of course, resource mobilization, you said the problem is allocation. We've had these resources. But I'll get back to you and we will clear the air about that. Let's cross over here to Christine and have her input in this. What do you think are the challenges that we are facing as Uganda in mobilizing resources? Do we have enough? Do you feel there's no challenge? If there are challenges, please let our dear viewer know.
Okay. I will agree to the statement by my two colleagues here. The resources will never be enough. But the problem, as economists, you have to set your priorities right. So that is where the problem will be. Now, with resource mobilization, the drive that the president set up was a very good initiative. It is something that helps us to develop a culture of mobilizing our funds, whereby us Ugandans, we're able to learn that we can be able to collect and solve part of our own problems. Instead of each time we have a challenge, we are thinking of outsiders. So it is something that is building up on our culture, which is a good thing. So this was an opportunity that gave different individuals, different companies, different personalities, agencies to come up and come up with different resources in cash, food. Some were giving out vehicles, some were giving out protective equipment for our medical staff, which was really good. But they had a target of, the committee had a target of around 176 billion but they were able to collect around 31 billion. Yes, there was a deficit, but it was a good thing from the word go. Then the major issue is how do you allocate these funds? Were they allocated right? Because remember, I will use an example whereby they had a suggestion of every Ugandan employee to contribute at least 10,000. But you see, if an employee feels like I'm already paying payee 40%, you're already taking a big chunk of my money, but you're not accounting even for the funds that you take out from this employee. That's why you would see someone arguing for just a 10,000 shillings. But if there's no accountability, even if you want to take off 2,000 from someone's income, it will be an inconvenience to them because they feel like, okay, I'm giving it to you, but what are you going to use it for? Is it going to go in the hands of just a few individuals? So the problem with Uganda is it's not mobilizing. People are really willing to give out, but the major problem lies in accountability. People always have that question. The citizens always have that question. Yes, I will collect in my funds, but are they going to do that particular role? Are they going to clear that particular challenge that was aimed at? Just like we've been following up in the news, you can imagine even after collecting foodstuffs, days down the road, officials in the Prime Minister's office were all over the news that they had inflated the prices. So that is where the whole challenge comes in.
Okay, Christine talked about resource mobilization, and one would ask themselves, maybe to mitigate this kind of loan burden we have on ourselves, as we've always talked about this show, about how we have very many loans, and then how that burden can really come back to us in the near future or in the other further future. One may think it is a culture maybe worth taking up, the culture of local mobilization, like we saw when the COVID-19 pandemic had just hit us, whenever the president would be on TV, there would be the prime minister after reading the donations, and really people really donated a lot of cars, a lot of food reliefs, and cash as well. Maybe I would ask you, Francis, let me start with you. Is it a culture worth grooming? Is it a culture we can really take up? And maybe, for example, if we say like we need a hospital in Jinja, and then we can say, people in Jinja, maybe let's get 10,000 from each of you. Then we can see where it can take us. Is local mobilization something that is healthy for us, or maybe it also has its demerits?
In fact, local mobilization is absolutely a big yes. Why? Because every economy, the best thing is to be self-reliant. So that's why I was up actually when I saw that initiative, different people are coming on board, companies, and contributed, generously. That shows you a solidarity of Ugandans. It's a very good thing, and it leads to self-reliance, which we all want. So the only issue I have is about the external borrowing. Uganda, we are addicted to external borrowing. And remember, we are getting these non-concessional loans. Their interest rate is actually above the market rate. So before COVID-19 came in, we had an issue of, low-cost invasion, floating islands, and floodings, and then COVID-19 came in. So of course the government got on board, to mobilize externally, and we got a loan of 400 million from IMF. We got over 300 million from World Bank, and then 30 million US dollars from the African Development Fund. So all that goes at a tune of 822 million US dollars. That's a lot of money. So the justification was to mitigate or minimize the socioeconomic, cost on the economy. And one of the things was actually to solve those short-term or immediate impact. Like safety nets, that's why, we saw the government giving food to the vulnerable poor, not to the poor, but to the vulnerable poor. And the question was, okay, you've borrowed all this money in the name of, solving such immediate or short needs. Now you're giving food that lasts only for 10 days, but people were locked for 6 months. So because we are addicted to this external borrowing, that's where the problem is. We need, as Darius has said, this is where I actually don't agree with Darius, that yes, I agree we need more. But the problem is borrowing is not a solution. We've borrowed enough. So far, when we look at our debt GDP ratio, just in 2020, it has grown from 40% to 49% from 2019. So that's a huge gap. And the other thing I want to tell the viewer out there is that the problem with external borrowing, it has the cost, besides the interest rate, because when we look at actually at our budget allocation, interest rate payment due goes up to 11%, bigger than health, education, agriculture, and all other important sectors, meaning that we are paying a big portion, in paying interest for these loans. And the other issue that I would like, members and the viewers out there to notice that I'll ask this question to you. Civil engineering was started in 1970 at Makerere University. Do you know why we still give contracts to Chinese or foreigners to construct our roads? The answer, I'm going to give you the answer. The answer is simple. Because of these external borrowings, they have terms and conditions. That's why you can even get a loan from those outside external sources. The money will never come to Uganda. The money will be just wired to those foreign companies, which are going actually to be contracted to construct these roads, these dams, you get. And yet we have engineers.
Okay, Francis, we shall have you tell us more, or dear viewer, to understand the issue of foreign aid and what it entails, because it is worth knowing, it is worth breaking down for a dear viewer to understand that it is a loan. Maybe everyone knows what a loan is. Everyone knows what, maybe a grant. A grant is of course, something that doesn't expect what is expected of a loan. A loan is maybe a burden. But Francis, later we shall come back to you and you dig deep into what a loan means to a country, what borrowing means to a country. Is it just the money we see? Is it using it and maybe repaying? We'd want to know all those attachments, what it comes with. Let's cross over to Darius. Darius, we're still talking resource mobilization. And we're talking about local mobilization. And we are given an example of if we need a hospital, if there is a need of a hospital somewhere in Jinja. Is it feasible? Is it really practical? Or will it keep working? Is it something we can keep to say, let's have every resident of Jinja give us 10,000 and we see where it takes us? Will it be something, a practice that is really worth keeping, or we can ditch it after this COVID-19?
No, thank you, Dan. Maybe to first
and you
point...
can also make your case, because I know something is biting.
Yes. First point to the disagreement, the issue of more or less is a relative term. It is, if you say we have more relative to what? I've already given you a scenario that what we need vis-a-vis what we need to spend on, we have a deficit. So if you're talking about over 800 million US dollars, you'd probably need to set up a hospital of 1 trillion US dollars in Jinja. But also on the issue of debt, I know there are stories, arguments for and against debt, and I will speak to that. Many people will tell you that actually debt is not a bad thing.
Let's first talk local mobilization, resource mobilization. Is it a bad thing? Then you can go over to debt.
No, it is not a bad thing. I've already given you the answer. It is something we need to grow because it relates to the golden rule which I spoke about.
Before you go to the debt, is there any chance that it will really help us do away with those loans or something? Is it practically possible?
It is practically possible if we do the planning and the prioritization very right. I think that is the starting point. But the only issue we have is that we tend to get those scattered success stories and want to use it as a justification that debt actually works. because there is debt which could have built a hospital somewhere. There is debt that could have built a road, people are using it. But those scattered success stories cannot be used to justify that debt works. By the way, in the history of economic development, you realize that there is no country that has ever developed without, borrowing. Speaking to countries like Singapore, countries like China, those countries were net borrowers in the early 60s. But because they did the planning well, they did prioritization well, over 2 decades, they were net lenders. For us, over 3 decades, we are still negotiating what is the best debt that we can get. Is it concessional or none? Sort of that. I think we need to do our planning very well. And by the way, if you can check on the figures, you realize that we borrow when we are not prepared. The last time I checked, towards the start of last fiscal year, we had over 4.3 billion US dollars loans that were not disbursed. We borrow, get the money, and they mature. Those loans mature when we have not disbursed them. That is, we are talking about close to 16 trillion Ugandan shillings. And that is a factory, that is a hospital somewhere that is being seated on. So to me, borrowing wouldn't be a big issue, but how do you spend that money?
Thank you very much, Darius. Dear viewer, you're still on The Equilibrium, where we talk economics. And as you may already know, we do this every Wednesday. You can always catch us on YouTube at 7:15. That's PM. We're still talking about resource mobilization. And before we go into the other segment of our discussion today, I want to go to you, Christine. Do you, as you pick up from Francis and Darius, do you think local resource mobilization, you had already hinted about it, I remember talking about how, because we studied it from you, but maybe to conclude this about local resource mobilization, what do you think could be the limit for us to achieve that? I mean, they're agreeing maybe, or maybe they're disagreeing, but we all know that maybe this is something we can think about anytime if we need to raise resources. But what do you think is the hindrance? Where do people say, no, this won't work? Where do the authorities say this won't work? Where are the hindrances? And what can we do better to have people believe, apart from the accountability and stuff? What do you think, what else can we do to have this resource mobilization on a local level believed in?
The major aspect of local mobilization, one, we have to have the politicians, our political leaders have to have the political will to do that. For example, if I can use an example of just the taxation system, whereby say, I'll use an example of say the tax holidays, where the people that we feel have the capacity to pay their fair share of the tax are actually exempted. So there are these practices that you do as leaders, but you don't know the kind of damage that you're doing to your population. So if there's that belief of, I would call it favoritism, of just the few groups of people who are being exempted, it will make these other citizens feel not catered for. So now they will bring in, a citizen will have this selfishness kind of nature in them, whereby they will feel, let me just do my thing and maybe make my way out. But the biggest problem is corruption. For example, I can use an example of the politicians and the tax havens. It's estimated that between 1999 to 2009, over 70 million US dollars are in tax havens. Tax havens are basically these secretive accounts in foreign countries that that people don't know about, where you're not able to tax. So if citizens are feeling like they're being treated unfairly, whereby the big shots are taking the bigger share of the funds for their own families or their own good to enrichen themselves. Definitely, you will never convince someone, a layman, who is trying to make maybe 10,000 a day, to maybe give even 5,000 of that money. The biggest, if you are to get this done, if we are able to collect funds, do the accountability. If you're, say, setting up a school, let's see the school being set up. Let's see are they using the right materials? Because there's an aspect of collecting money, say, for a school, but within a few days it breaks down because of inadequate materials being used. So the entire problem, it's not that people don't want to give in their money, but let me give in my money, knowing that it's going to go for that particular good, and we are going to benefit as a country in the long run.
Yes, thank you. Trust issues. At the end of the day, that's what I pick from what we're talking about. It is about trust, because a person, a citizen, wants to give out the money. I can as well agree that if I give out my money, I want to know how it has been used. But let's cross over and then continue this discussion and talk about these loans. Francis, let's talk about loans. Before we go for a break, let's talk about what it is for a country like Uganda, which is known for borrowing. For the dear viewer out there who is watching us, they might not know the details, the nitty-gritties of what a loan means to a country. In 1 or 2 minutes, you can really break it down for a dear viewer to understand, if my country borrows, what comes with that borrowing.
Thank you, Dan. To break it down to our dear viewer out there is just put it at an individual basis. You as an individual, you want a loan. Why do you want a loan? That should be the first question. Because as we've said that resources will never be enough, first of all, you have to know that you have to spend what you can afford. Not thinking that you will borrow, to be in a position to spend on what you don't or what you cannot afford. But I also agree that the debt itself is not bad. The problem is, how are you going to use it? And that's actually why I've seen politicians come and compare our Uganda's GDP debt ratio to that of USA. Because, for example, USA's debit GDP ratio is at 105%. Japan is at 237%. But you cannot compare, or Uganda cannot compete to get these loans like those developed countries. Why? I want you to differentiate, let's say, USA and Uganda. In Uganda, we know that corruption has been institutionalized. It's like part of the culture. So I will tell you how dangerous it is. You're going to borrow in the name of, you want to have, this economic, growth and development. But when in actual sense, you're actually increasing income inequality. Why? You borrow, and then this money you borrow, or the funds, end up not doing what they're supposed to do. I will give you an example. For example, we've always borrowed, to invest in infrastructure. Like we've constructed dams, to produce electricity. But we are producing, let's say, in excess capacity. But tell me the coverage, the national coverage as far as electricity is concerned, it is at 22%, the lowest in the region. Even Rwanda is doing better than us. But we have borrowed huge sums of money in the name of, investing in infrastructure development. Look at the bridges. You saw that bridge in Ginger. It didn't take a month to see cracks. Just look at our roads. You expect a road to be a 3-layer. It is a 1-layer. Where did the money go? The money is eaten by a few people, a handful few people. You see, that's what the problem is. So you're borrowing in the name of, you want every Ugandan to benefit, but yet the few Ugandans who are benefiting. So you're going to find that you're actually leading to income inequality because of corruption. But if you're borrowing and you use the funds efficiently, there's no question about that. But for the case of Uganda, that's what I'm saying. And you are too addicted. You know, loans can be addictive, even to you as an individual. You have to be very careful. So now that we are not yet in a position already to have or to manage such loans or huge sums of money, first plan to see how much you can afford, and you first leave the other expenses which you can't afford. By the way, I will tell you that Uganda as a country, the way we spend, it's like we are a huge economy. When you look at the avenues or the areas where you spend too much, you just look at security. You see? It's not productive. It's not a productive sector. You would be spending in agriculture. You look at how much we spend on foreign missions. Uganda has almost an embassy in every country, even those countries where when you would follow up the number of tourists or people coming from those countries. You get. So Uganda, we should start by learning to spend on what we can afford. Because the debt we have today, it is going to take over 100 years. That is if you stop taking loans, by the way, external loans.
Maybe it could be about, you could say the person who is borrowing is not the person who is paying, maybe. Anyway, let me not go there.
Okay, the government that is borrowing right now, most of them are not going to be here when we are paying.
So when you borrow and you're not the one who's going to pay, most likely you'll misuse the money. Is it what I should take out from your statement?
That's also, I mean, you can agree. These people are borrowing like there is no tomorrow. Because if, let's say, the loans, the amount we have right now, is going to take over 100 years. Most of us may be, I mean, like someone who is over 30 years, you think they are going to be here? No, so the Bazukulu are going to pay, even the Bazukuls are going to pay.
Okay, thank you, Francis. This is still the equilibrium, and this debate is getting hotter and hotter. That's what I take from the last statement he said about the Bazukulu paying. Maybe you could say the people borrowing are not the people who are going to do what? They're not the people who are going to pay. So ideally, if I'm not going to pay this loan that I'm going to acquire, I'm going to misuse it. Maybe. That's just my thought. We're going for a short break, and we shall be back on the same issue of loans and much more about resource allocation, and especially in this COVID-19 era. I'm still Dan Ayevale, your host. Let's come back. Welcome back from that break, a very short break that we had right there. We're still talking economics, and my name is Dan Ayevale. To remind you, I have Darius, I have Francis, and I have Christine on this panel. And this is the trial that is always here every other Wednesday to give you what is happening in the economic world and in Uganda in particular. But we always cross over and connect what is working here to what works out there, and then we are able to come out with what we think can really help us improve what is going on in our country as a panel here on the equilibrium. We're still talking about the loans. Before we went to the short break, we're still talking about loans, acquiring loans by the government of Uganda. And we wanted you, the dear viewer, to understand, to know what the loan means. What does it mean when you hear that the government has been afforded $300 million to do something? The government has got this grant. The government has got this kind of money from maybe an organization, from a country, from anywhere where we borrow, very many avenues where Uganda borrows and other countries borrow from. So let me cross over to Darius, and we dig deep into this as we head into another segment. Darius, borrowing. Talk about borrowing. Francis talked about how it is kind of a burden at one point, borrowing, because it comes with those the attached terms and conditions. But maybe our dear viewer out there might not understand what it means for borrowing as far as terms and conditions apply. That's what there is, terms and conditions apply. What does it mean for a normal person, a layman out there when a government acquires a loan?
Thank you, Dan. A loan, yes, I agree, a loan is a burden, because if a government has acquired a certain amount of loan, the implication is that you have to repay back that amount, as well as pay a cost for borrowing, because it is sort of a transaction. There is an interest that you pay after borrowing. So at the end of the period that they give you, you're supposed to pay that amount as well as the interest that accrues to it. So, like I said, borrowing should be done to finance a certain activity or a certain project. And in project appraisal, we are often told that you should finance an activity which will be able to refinance the cost. So if government you have borrowed to say invest in a certain project, what is its intended outcome and how is it going to refinance that cost? I think it is that will, release or relax some fiscal stress that countries face. In any case, you borrow and the project is not going to refinance that cost, it becomes a huge cost to the government. And given the fact that we are living in such times where we are facing fiscal stress, I think we need, a large participation of citizens in as far as resource mobilization is concerned, but also on reducing some of the spending habits or spending patterns that we have. Francis talked about us, Uganda, spending as if we are China or Japan. And in fact, when you put Uganda's economy on paper, it resembles much that of Japan. It is more or less a G8 economy, because what these guys do, or what it means, that a vast number of people are excluded from the economy. We have about 66% of the population who are not part of the economy, those who are directly employed in subsistence farming. That's their major source of income. You go to the garden, all transactions take place in the garden, what you eat. And now we have reached to an extent where even the inputs that they use, they no longer finance themselves. Like hose, these rudimentary tools that they use, most of them are provided by politicians. So we need to broaden the economy, and when you also visit the planning process, when you visit the national development plans, Vision 2040, you see the kind of person we are budgeting for is not a typical Ugandan. It is as if we are budgeting or planning for a bureaucrat.
Before I leave you, who decides when to borrow for our dear viewer? Is it the bank? Is it Museveni?
It is a whole process.
Exactly.
It's a process.
I want our dear viewer to understand.
There are different stakes that are involved to borrow. Usually...
I might know, but for our dear viewer.
Yes. If you want to request for a loan, it goes through a process. You table it to Parliament. It is subject to the approval of Parliament. And the idea is that MPs who pass those loans are representatives of the people. So ideally, by representation, a citizen, you've also allowed that the country should borrow.
So we borrow. We shouldn't be having this topic even, that who borrows. We borrow as a country.
Yes, we borrow as a country, because the MPs we choose to represent us are the ones who pass that this should go and we borrow this amount. But I wanted to speak to the kind of tough decisions that we need to take going forward, in as far as mobilizing resources, but also reducing on the spending patterns. We shouldn't spend as if there is no tomorrow. We are spending on items that are non-productive. I told you in a second episode that now we are borrowing to finance elections. We are spending on security. Where can we put this money that, in the future it can refinance the costs of borrowing. There are about 6 elements. There are 4 elements. If I'm to speak to them and also weigh in how we are doing in as far as those elements are concerned, one of them is the government environment. How does it, increase citizen participation in resource mobilization, as well as also trying to reduce on the spending behaviors. The government environment has about 2 components which I may speak to. One is the nature of institutions, the nature of governance that we have. Do we have institutions or rules of the game that are pluralistic? By pluralistic, I mean that favor a huge number of people. Or do we have extractive institutions that favor a few? To my case, I think we have extractive institutions. And if institutions or rules of the game are not well stipulated, well established, you'll always have those issues of corruption, lack of accountability, and the like. Then there is also a political culture. What is that political culture that we have? Is it the one that really is positive and accepts input, or it is one that rejects? And citizens are less likely to participate if the political culture is one that is not positive or the one that does not, accept input. In academia, we have faced that challenge. Whenever we have anything to tell those who are in charge of this government, they don't accept our input. They want to do their thing. What they always tell you is that yours is theoretical. And then they are more interested foreigners doing the work. When they employ the foreigners to come and do some of the consultancies, they end up hiring us to do them on their behalf. They inform the government, but of course it will have a biased outcome because foreigners also want it subjected in a kind of direction. The other element which disturbs me a lot is the process design on how we plan, how we budget, how we allocate. It is very disturbing. How do we budget? How do we plan? Is our planning anchored on programs? Is it anchored on projects? Or it is just one of earmarking like we are having? Just, sit somewhere and say, last time we spent this amount, then the following fiscal year we should spend much more than. And the beginning of wisdom is that our plans or our budgets are never reviewed when we are starting the budget process. To me, I think we need a planning or budgeting that is oriented to programs. Because in fiscal policy, the issue of allocation is more of what they call a chimera. A chimera is sort of a thing which is supposed to be done or which you hope to achieve, but in practice it is hard or impossible to achieve because it more or less relates to competing policy outcomes and objectives. What informs us, for example, to spend on say 1 billion shillings on activity A instead of spending it on activity B? Oh, why do we allocate much to security sector? Or why do we spend much to works and transport and not allocate that money to human capital development, say health and education sector? So the process is disturbing. Once the process is disturbing, the third element relates to mechanism that you have in place to ensure that a credible budget or a good plan is achieved. Because that would take you to the issue of how you involve people to participate in planning. For us, we mainly use public meetings, that you gather people to come, sit, and make some input to plan. And evidence tells us that actually public meetings do not have a direct impact on participants. Their input is not well thought, not well informed, and usually is not well captured. We need planning that is based on a combination of other methods. We need to do surveys, because once you do a survey based on willingness to pay or willingness to accept, then it will inform you that this project or this activity will be able to refinance the cost that I'm allocating to. We also need to do budget simulations, as well as establishing advisory committees on some of those activities or programs that we put in place.
Okay, thank you very much, Darius. Darius takes us to where we're heading to, resource allocation, and we shall pick it from there. But before we go there, for the first time, by the Francis is agreeing with you. I saw him doing this, and I was like, okay, he agrees with you on this one. So, Christine, over to you. He talks about maybe, to rephrase what he says, maybe prioritizing where we spend. And at a point where I remember at one point on this show, Professor Nwagaba talked about how in this pandemic, the health budget was decreased compared to the one of last year when there was no pandemic. What do you take out of that?
And we pass a budget without a plan.
What that means, it means that we are not being real. It means maybe we are living in some other kind of economy, not really Uganda. That is what it would really mean. For example, if you can, I can use an estimate of, say, the PPEs, the protective equipment for a doctor. It is estimated that one PPE can cost about 40,000 shillings. And for us to make sure that our doctors and the frontline workers who are trying to fight this pandemic are protected efficiently, it is estimated that on a daily would spend about 120 million, which would give us an annual estimated cost of over 44 billion. But when you look at what was budgeted for, it means that as our country was planning the budget process, they were living in denial of this of what was happening in reality, because this would mean that much of the resources would actually go to the health sector to make sure that it is beefed up, to ensure that our doctors are protected effectively, they pay for their different allowances, make sure that the ambulance system is up and running. How many ambulances do we have? Look at the ICU beds. For example, at the start of the pandemic, Mulago had 40 ICU beds by that time, at the beginning of March. So this is where most of the cost will go to. Even you look at what every country, every serious country is trying to go into research, search for a vaccine, search for how can you make your own testing kits, because when you make your own testing kits locally, it means that the cost is going to go down. So would think that more resources would be allocated to, say, Makerere University that is trying to come up with testing kits, the different scientists that are trying to come up with a vaccine initiatives. So would really think that a serious country, that is where the focus would be. But just like I said at the start of the question, it means that the time they were making the budget, because by the time they read the budget in June, this pandemic
3 months, sorry.
Yeah, because our first case was recorded around 22nd March. So really, it means that we are not being realistic. We're trying to live in denial instead of making sure that we plan according to what we have at hand and ensure that that we attack this problem. How do we solve this problem? Yet we know that it is going to be very costly. So I would imagine that would have been that would have been the first step, because budgets are not static. These are dynamic things that you can sit and make appropriate changes depending on what is happening in the economy at that point in time.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Francis, Christine talks about how a budget is not static, and I want us to talk about that because we knew about COVID-19. Forget when we got the first case. We knew about it right from December. We knew about COVID-19, and maybe you would think we never really thought it would reach here, or maybe we thought it was a Chinese problem. So I want us to know, how is budget drawing that static, like she says? How is the process that rigid that we couldn't really change that figure or change the man and say, now there's this pandemic that might reach us, or maybe even in March we have got the first case? Was there no allowance? As an economist, you may be knowing about how the budget process goes on. By March, when the budget is ready in June, was there no allowance for the budget to be maybe fine-tuned to address this problem we are facing right now?
Thank you, Dan. The problem we have in this country is fiscal indiscipline. You know, Joe Biden said that, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I will tell you what you value. When you look at Uganda's budget, not only for this financial year, for even all those past financial years, when you look at our budget and you see how we allocate resources, oh my God, you can really see that Uganda, we are in trouble, especially for the last 30 years. You know, when they talk of steady progress, I don't understand. Maybe it is the other way around. So, but talking about the budget, when you look at Uganda's budget, for example, talking about fiscal indiscipline, what are your priorities? When you look at our budget, you're going to realize that actually our priority in Uganda is actually spending much on guns, because a big chunk goes to security. You're going to realize that financial year 2019-2020, the budget, the resources allocated to security were accounting for 11%, and now they have been increased to 12%, as opposed to health, whose allocations actually have been reduced from 7.9% to 7.7%. I mean, this doesn't need you to be an economist. This is not rocket science. That during these unprecedented times of COVID-19, where you should be allocating more resources in the health sector, yes, instead you're increasing the budget allocations in the security forces. You might think that, I remember I said that the way the government is approaching this, or they were saying, this is a war, because I mean, these are military people. They like the word war. But this wasn't only, it's both an economic and a health war. But if you look at the way resources were being allocated, you might think that this was the war of guns, ammunitions, not actually, a medical issue. So I want you to look at that. Instead of increasing the budget allocations of the health sector, instead you're increasing those of security. So it's all about priorities. And the problem we have in this country is fiscal indiscipline. Can you imagine? Even the agricultural sector, talking about development or economic development, gets the least one. It's one of the least funded, sector. Agriculture takes 3.8. So we are spending too much resources on non-productive sectors. We should thank God that actually COVID-19 hasn't hit us that bad, because go out there in those hospitals, government or public, hospitals, the health sector is the structure is completely broken down. I mean, maybe one day, go out there. The viewers out there, they know what I'm talking about. Go and do a survey. You're going to find that we have hospitals which don't even have beds. Even those which have beds, they don't have mattresses. The nurses, the medics, they don't have, where they don't have PPEs. They don't even have gloves. But we are spending a big chunk on security. I don't know if Uganda were fighting wars, which I'm not aware of. So it's all about priorities. The fiscal indiscipline in this country is way beyond. And we've been persistent and consistent for over the last, 30 years.
All right, Francis, I don't know why you're insisting on the 30 years. Maybe the 30 years might be symbolic of something. I don't want to go there. But I thank you. I thank you for submission. And all right, it talks about spending on guns and more than we spend on the health sector. I remember in the news at one point, not in the news, there was someone's opinion saying, how do you have LDUs, I mean, even soldiers being rolled out in a pandemic, while nurses and doctors have their schools locked? So maybe that's where you're coming from, but we shall continue from there. You can go. You can have your submission finished up in 1 minute.
Allow me to say this before it even skips my mind. Someone will be like, okay, we need this money. We have a big parade of soldiers, LDU, and this security personnel. Someone might urge out that they are giving them employment. You have to look at productivity. You get? You take all these people, the LDU, the UPDF, people, take them into agriculture because agriculture is a productive sector. So the problem is we are spending on non-productive sectors.
Okay. Francis, thank you. Let me take your microphone. I will be back to your seat in a few minutes to come. Dear viewer, you're still on the Equilibrium, and you will find this live on your YouTube every Wednesday at 7:15. That's 7:15 p.m. On a Wednesday. I mean, when you're chilling in jam, maybe you can grab your phone and then look out for our channel, and you'll be able to watch these videos and get to understand more about the economy in Uganda and how it relates with you, with anyone in this era, COVID-19. And of course, in the future, we shall not stop on this. Even when COVID-19 is gone, we shall be here to tell you more and maybe dig deep into what the economy is and all the nitty-gritties and all the details that are involved with economics in Uganda and beyond. We are about to reach the end of this show, but let's have these comments before we leave this show. Before we reach the final comments anyway, I would want to hear from you, Christian. Resource allocation. Francis was talking about how the government is maybe doing it the way he disagrees with, right? Allocating resources to the security more than the health, and at the end of the day, he feels there is an imbalance, maybe, and it's about priorities actually. So, what can be done, I mean, by the government or any responsible authorities to really redesign the priorities of our economy? What can anyone do? I mean, who is in charge of that budget? What can be done? What is possible? Is it just talking about on such shows? Isn't there anything practical that can be done to restructure the priorities? Or we shall stop here talking on this show, the Equilibrium?
At the end of the day, much as us, the economists, academicians, come up with different views, yes, first we can advise on the best means they can do it. But you see, economics and politics move hand in hand. The politicians have to have the political will, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that get these things implemented. So if the politician at the top wants the biggest portion of the budget to go to security, that is what will be done. So we have to advocate for the political will, and if that is put in place, then we shall have our priorities set right. And now I will just comment about. I'm going to use an example of how the food distribution was given out. For example, at the start of the lockdown, they estimated for the urban people that couldn't afford. These were basically in Kampala and Wakiso, where they estimated for around 1.5 million people. But when you look at, that is where I'm saying that I'm using it as an example of how we set our priorities. For example, when you look at our entire country, we have this pandemic estimate at the start of the pandemic. We estimated that that the economic shocks or the economic challenges would hit around 3.15 million people. That is a rough estimate, drawing them into poverty, which would add to the already existing 8.1 million people before the pandemic. But when you look at the figures of the people that were about to draw into the poverty line and those that were already below the poverty line, and just look at the people that the government had estimated to support with the food deliveries of around 1.5 million people for only Wakiso and um, and Kampala. That shows you something. It's the best description of maybe you're planning for a home that you don't live in. So at the end of the day, we have to be realistic. Let's get our priorities right. Let us get to know what is really happening in our economy. That alone will help us plan right. Now, I can use another example of the cut in the health budget. Now, if you look at the budget of also just Butabika Hospital, it was also cut on various items and equipments that the hospital was supposed to get. Now, the pandemic comes along with other effects. For example, mental health issues, basically because of the pressure and the uncertainty that the pandemic came along with. Now, if the government is planning and you're getting such cuts in the health budget, you're cutting budget for say Butabika Hospital, yet you know one of the effects of the pandemic, it would definitely come along with the mental health related issues. And where are these people going to be treated? They would definitely have to go to Butabika Hospital. So that shows you something about our economy, about our politicians, about the people that have the authority to make these decisions. They have to have their political will and get to be realistic. Plan for the home that you live in.
Thank you, Christine. Let me cross over to the gentleman besides you, Darius. She talks about the political side of it. And yes, the political will. And that's why I want you to dive in. And after that, you'll give us your recommendations for this that we've been talking about. But about the political will, it takes us back to what we were talking about when we were talking elections, when we were talking about the money that is involved in elections. And of course, when the people spend that money, they know the power they have. So does that draw us back to that debate of saying maybe the people that should be making these decisions for us should be sober enough, we should maybe think about restructuring everything right from, I'm trying to connect it there. I don't know how you will really bring it.
Yeah, we need a lot of restructuring if we are to move this country forward. Uganda is mixed in a cocktail of challenges, so many problems. And to jump out, we really need a lot of restructuring. I talked about the process design because that's where most of the things are flouted. And the viewer out there will agree with me that the process of planning, budgeting, and allocating resources is bloated. It's very big. And as a result, if the other four elements I talked about are not well established and well enforced, the outcome is going to be bad. I talked about the government environment, where I talked about institutions and whether they can, enforce these processes. The other thing I didn't mention are the legal requirements. What are some of the legal requirements in some of these processes to ensure that a good outcome is concerned? And those legal requirements actually eventually end up having unintended effects on the outcome. those legal requirements, to me, going forward, they should be creating some kind of independence or autonomy of local government units. You know, when you put the process, the budget, the planning process for Uganda, it more or less looks like a bottom-up kind of approach, that the planning starts at the grassroots. They start from at the sub-county level, where those sub-county committees send in their plans, they send to the district send to the line ministries, and then finance, harmonizes all those plans. But being bloated, to me, that process has been inflicted by politicians. They have infiltrated the process, and now they are hijacking the processes. I can tell you that there are some local councils that receive the money towards the end of the quarter. Finance, you collect the money, then finance does not disburse the money. And in certain situations, we have had the stories where authorities in the Ministry of Finance are requiring some kind of money from these local councils. You first pay, then they disburse the money. This is because they don't have the independence to mobilize on their own and allocate on their own. And if you check the history of that process, the developments that have come with, at one point those local councils, those local council units had the power to collect on their own and spend. And the country was arguably doing well compared to when that autonomy, that independence was taken away. Because at the end of the day, it causes the other market failure I usually talk about, moral hazard or more or less free riding. The fact that I don't mobilize resources my own and don't allocate them myself, I will sit down, I will not enforce the businesses to pay the taxes, and I will require that at the end of the day that the central government will remit the money and I will use it. So those in the villages are not enforcing businesses to pay taxes, to collect revenue. And even these ones in town where the demands are relatively higher compared to rural settings, they tend to relax, because if I enforce and you collect more money in my area, then you give me less. There is no incentive for me the next fiscal year to do the enforcement. Around 60% of the revenues is collected here within the city center, tax revenue. But also the issue of fiscal indiscipline is affecting us as a country. Like Francis said, we need to stop this business of spending on non-productive ventures. If you look at the way we spend, I think we spend about 4.7 trillion. That is the total wage bill, paying wages. Then for consumptive items, we pay around 2.8 trillion, vis-a-vis the money that we spend on projects. On projects, we spend about 9.1 trillion. So the consumptive items are more or less equal to the productive items that we do spend on. And now we are financing elections. Going forward, we need to be faced with the reality. And if we don't, actually, in the future, when the effects become cruel, the reality will hit us, and we will have to have a sober mind to plan. Okay. Because, Dan, if I may mention, often we ask students of development economics that would you rather be poor in a rich country or be rich in a poor country?
The answer?
That is a disturbing question.
The most common answer is?
The answer is that people should live moderate lives. Either of the excesses is not good.
Saying ABC, then you've added your E. God, and
You have to live a moderate life, because being poor in a rich country is also not good, but also being rich in a poor country is not good. The costs are huge. The costs of income inequality in Uganda are apparent. The rich no longer sleep because we have those poor ones who are rotating around and giving them headache. So eventually, these people who are flouting on the rules to enrich themselves, and those are majorly people who are in government controlling the processes, if they don't get that comfort of living within this country, I think with the time they would have a sober mind to rethink and plan budget for a typical Ugandan.
okay, Darius. Darius, thank you very much. That has reminded me of a friend at one point who told me that if you're rich, if you accumulate a lot of wealth, make sure that people around you are also rich. Because at the end of the day, those are your burdens as well.
The relationship between happiness and wealth is also critical. The evidence suggests that if you're a person and you spend a year, on average, if you spend more than $72,000, happiness tends to decline.
Which science formula is that?
Finish. Because you lose things like privacy. In Uganda, this tendency of building perimeter walls, it is a cost of inequality. What is it so private about us that we are hiding in those?
Maybe hiding the loot. Okay, thank you very much, Darius. Dear viewer, you're still on the Equilibrium, and click that subscribe button, and you always get those notifications about our videos that go live when we're live every Wednesday at 9:15 p.m. Francis, as we wind up, you may want to have a comment about what you think is the way forward. What are your recommendations in general? What do you think Uganda as an economy can do? Which practices can we adopt to mitigate this that we are talking about, the resource allocation challenge, having the non-essential, I like that word because it has really made meaning in this COVID-19, non-essential sectors having much of the budget, and then what we call the essential ones having less budget. What practices do you think Uganda as an economy or authorities can really adopt?
Thank you, Dan. When you look at our economy and you look, the issues we have, it's a whole cobweb of issues. But we need a real restructure. We need to restructure everything. He has talked of because the budgeting process starts actually way back in September. But as I said, that the planning process is hijacked by politicians, because the planning process is supposed to start right away from the grassroots. But you realize that at the end, the output in the budget, the people at the grassroots are not represented, meaning that the process is hijacked. So when you look at our budget, you will think that we budget and then plan. So the recommendation are, because we've seen that the biggest challenge we have in this country is fiscal indiscipline, we need to restructure and rearrange our priorities by ranking those sectors which are productive, yes, and ending with those which are non-productive. And that's why we are saying things in this country are upside down. We are allocating too much resources to security, for example, which is not productive. And yet, like in these unprecedented times of COVID-19, we are instead reducing the resources allocated to health. Thank God the COVID-19 situation isn't bad here, but if it was to hit us like the way it is in Brazil, we don't have the capacity, the health sector, the structure is completely broken down. So we need to rearrange our priorities. This argument of, saying that people are employed in security force, the security personnel, these people should be pushed productive sectors like agriculture.
So what are you trying to say? I don't know if this won't put me into trouble, but I always see soldiers lying somewhere where they are, and they can even spend months without any big assignment. So what if we send them to farms? What if we
That's what I'm talking about. You have a parade of security personnel, let's say UPDF, police, police, then you have LDU. Not forgetting actually the other big parade of RDCs. He has talked of the other big wage bill we have in this country. You need to send these people to the productive sectors like agriculture. After all, we say agriculture is the backbone of Uganda. Is it, we say that, but that is not, we don't implement that.
our backbone is security?
Yeah, in fact, the backbone of this, very good, the backbone of this country when you look at our budget is security, which is not productive. So the whole thing, my recommendations are that now that we know that fiscal indiscipline is the biggest challenge of this country, we need to arrange and rank the priorities, the way it is supposed to be. Otherwise, we are going to keep on just talking. The government will keep on giving us hope, but in reality, they are not doing the right thing. That one, it doesn't need someone who studied economics or rocket science to look at our budget and see that security is the backbone of this country, not agriculture, by the allocations that are appearing on our budget.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis. Francis talks about physical discipline, and in discipline, I mean, thank you for the correction, and maybe discipline in discipline. Okay, and it's what we can note for now, because ideally, the politicians are what our bosses in this, and their discipline. You talked of hijacking the process in the middle there. Maybe you could tell us what hijacking are you talking about, then we can have a final comments. Francis, how are they hijacking the process of budgeting? Maybe to be clear on this.
Thank you. I mean, like as I've told you, when you look at our budget, you're going to see that it's not representing the normal Ugandan out there. A typical Ugandan out there in the village, you would see, let's say, agriculture being the agricultural sector, health sector, education being one of those sectors that are getting allocated a big chunk of resources, and yet it's the other way around. You are seeing a big chunk going to security.
Do we need to hold an election to know which sector is really on the hearts of the people? I mean, these people know this thing.
The question all goes, as Darius has said, it all goes to the politicians we send. Of course, remember we had the other topic about the political economy of this country. That's why I'm telling you that the issues in this country, it's like a cobweb. That's why we need a real restructuring. It's like we need to restructure everything and start afresh, because everything is upside down.
Okay, seriously, can a survey work like Darius said? If we are going to the budget, we say we want to hold a survey to see what is really the reality. Or these people know the reality, maybe. They don't need a survey.
No, they are not even aware, by the way. If you go back to my village at the sub-county and you call people to come and start the budgeting process.
Not the process, but a survey. You could really find opinion leaders in a village, maybe, I'm thinking, and then you get these ideas out of them. You're like, what do you think is really... you're already laughing, maybe.
I mean, like, I'm imagining where you're asking these people that of health, security, and agriculture, what do you think is the most important? Absolutely, they would.
It is sarcastic here. Maybe I'm trying to be sarcastic because these people know, right? I mean, the people who design the budget really know that health is more important in this kind of era than security, or it has always been what we should be the first go-to point. So we could talk till the day ends, but we cannot really know why it is always security.
It's all about the political will. It's all about the political will. That's why the way things are done, income inequality is the gap. is ever, widening because of how we allocate these resources, of how we prioritize, these sectors. So I'm telling you that it doesn't take much for one to say agriculture, health, and let's say education are more important than security. That's why I'm telling you, this is COVID-19 pandemic era. You would expect a huge chunk of resources, or you would expect the health sector to be boosted, with more resources. Now we are saying the health sector's resources are now being reduced, and yet the security sector, we are seeing more resources being allocated to the security sector.
Okay, Francis, in the interest of time, we shall maybe
Thank you.
have you your comments later. I want to start with you having final comments. And if you have any other comment to make, let it be brief.
Thank you, Dan. In one of the public forums I attended, I advised that actually we needed to get Minister of Finance out of the planning process because it has failed to manage it and the politicians have infiltrated it. But of course they said I was theoretical. How can you how can you kick out a whole ministry that is responsible for managing a process? To me, I was thinking we needed to, bring back the independence of local governments, as far as resource mobilization is concerned and also allocation. But going forward, like Francis has said, we need a lot of restructuring of these processes. And that restructuring should be informed by what public sector economists often call Rawlsianism. John Rawls has a thinking that in planning or intervening, we should always consider maximizing the welfare of the worst of individual. The worst of individual in this case is a typical Ugandan. And who is a typical Ugandan? Considering the demographics and the other related issues. When you look at age, average age, a typical Ugandan is probably a 14-year-old person when you consider age. And given the fact that females are more than males, is likely to be a female. 14-year-old is perhaps raised by a single mother, because usually also that sector of family is not doing very well. We have more single parents in this era. And that person, that 14-year-old what is the need of that 14-year-old? Does she need a tarmac road? And like I was saying, we need to do surveys or simulations of these things. What is informing ministries that we need to spend more on infrastructure? Is there a survey which has been conducted that actually the intended outcomes of infrastructure development are being met? Because usually the thinking or common sense is that whenever you put up an infrastructure, it is going to link markets. So we end up putting roads where even markets don't exist. And then farmers will move their produce from, the gardens to the market. In areas which I visit in the rural areas, there is one I visited in Chiboga. They were very happy, I think in 2010, when they received the road, a new road. That place used to be a hub of matoke and cassava for the entire district. So they were happy that now they have gotten the road, they are going to, now transport their produce to the market. But 2 years down the road, the markets were hijacked. I told you about institutions' rule of the game, the issue of property rights. A certain group of elites from, government, I will not mention the institution, they came and said, this is government land. People have been there for centuries, growing matoke. And they kicked them out of that land, about 300 hectares of land. One individual takes it up, puts a tree plantation farm. Agricultural productivity has reduced. So when we don't address these fundamentals, most times, even the intended outcomes we intended to achieve are not met. Infrastructure development is simply extending the tyranny of middlemen and also the elite capture. Where roads have extended, people have gone there to, chase away those farmers who are using the land. But also there is a recent survey which came out which showed that if the money we are investing in infrastructure, had we put it in education and health, the growth of the economy would be 4 times more than what we have achieved. It is there, empirical evidence. And I think we need to spend on sectors that present opportunities to the typical Ugandan. Human capital development is key. In history, there is no country which has ever developed without prioritizing human capital development, health and education. Then on top of that, industrialization. In fact, the saying that agriculture is the backbone of an economy is a myth if we are to consider structural economic transformation. The backbone is industrialization because it presents both forward and backward linkages to other sectors.
Yes. Thank you, Darius. What I pick from your submission is that, like you last said, industrialization is a way to go, and maybe investing in human capital is a way to go. Thank you. I'm coming this side to Christine. Dear Madame Christine, I would want to have your last comments and your general comments anyway, in general, as you wrap up this on your side, and then we shall cross over to Francis and we call it a day. Thank you, Christine.
My final comments, just an overview of what we've been discussing and about this entire topic at hand. The government, that is the politicians, at the end of the day, they have to have the political will, be realistic, get to know the needs of the common man in the country. That will be able to guide us on the planning process and how effective the decisions that we come up with can be implemented. For example, talking about the expenditure patterns of the government, in this COVID era, would really expect the government to put more of the funding into the health care system. But this has not been done as would have expected. I would just use an example. If an ordinary citizen is maybe you're seated at home, you're reading in the news, hearing the government has gotten $300 million from World Bank, then IMF, then African Development Fund, and most of these monies came in to help in the mitigation of the effects of COVID-19, helping the testing process, helping in mitigating the economic effect on the population. So if an ordinary man is listening to news, hearing all this funding coming in, then at the end of the day, the government is asking for 5,000, or the individuals to start paying for their own testing of 240,000. These are the practices that make the citizen, the common man, lose trust in the government. Question if the government is being realistic. Question if the government is really part of the ordinary man. Are they detached? Are they in this country? Just like I said that before that, if you're planning for the government should be realistic. Plan like you're planning for your own home, because you know where the priorities are. you know what is challenging the family, you know where the funding should be going depending on the challenges at hand. So the government should be more realistic and not look like they're detached from the common man. Yeah.
Thank you. That means from your submission, they should make it and maybe mold it to be into a family kind of setup and put it in that picture. I could say, no, school fees first, a suit second. Maybe food first, alcohol for the head of the family comes last. Okay, Francis, the microphone is yours. And please bless us with your last comments.
Thank you. But my last comment about today's topic is that we need to rearrange our priorities. For God's sake, we're in a COVID-19 pandemic era. We don't have to spend or allocate more resources in the security sector and instead reduce resources allocated to the health sector. The health sector right now should be taken as a priority. And of course, even education. And we should not borrow in the name of, mitigating the economic or socio-economic impact of this COVID-19 and spend money on buying masks of which they never reached most of the people. Buy radios that you want to embrace, teaching kids on radios, via radios and TVs. And borrowing in the name of you want to give people food or safety nets, and instead of giving them food for 6 months, you give them for 10 days. That all indicates the fiscal indiscipline we have in this country. So we need to solve that issue of fiscal indiscipline. Let's allocate resources. Let us rearrange our priorities to the most productive sectors. Thank you.
All right, before you leave the microphone, or maybe before we close this show, I will give you the opportunity to answer this. You talk of masks. Have you ever received a mask? The government mask?
I've never. But
did you receive food?
Never.
Do you have other people you know?
I'm not. Because the food was meant for the vulnerable people, so I can imagine the vulnerable poor. There is a poor and vulnerable poor.
What I'm trying to say is we've had all these promises. If I could remember, masks at one point where we were told within 2 weeks we'll have your masks. Then after we had this about food, and I used to stay in Wakiso those days, I never saw the food as per in my village. There was the food never reached there, and for a fact, very many villages, the food never reached there, and the distribution, I don't know if they're still distributing or maybe if the people should still wait. I'm just remembering these things that have really been talked about, and we never see them reach the last person in the villages. Does the president set them out of, I don't want to say ignorance, maybe I didn't say that, but is he not sure that these things won't reach there? Is he lied to? What do you think?
This is like looking for an avenue of just wasting resources.
The president tells us that you're going to have masks in 2 weeks. And then after Don Wanyama comes out and is like, maybe like trying to say our president lied. Or even the Ministry of Health or maybe the responsible authorities never come out to say, okay, this is what happened. They will keep quiet. About food, they did this. About masks, they did this. Radios, this is something that has been here for like how many months, right?
I understand radios, they are now in the final stages of procuring them. So they are soon coming. Do you know how much money has been allocated for those radios?
Let's not go there. So
the question is, you're proposing these solutions. Please think about them. They are not sustainable. But as he has said, I don't say that I don't agree that the elite have captured. No, it's a handful of. It's actually a big parade of politicians and a few elites who have connived. Because people in the Ministry of Finance, we have economists there. They know these things, but of course, it's just a handful of these few technocrats. Simply call them idiot technocrats because they know how dangerous this is, but they will go ahead and connive with politicians.
Okay. The equilibrium may go on and on and on and on because these people I have on my panel are very, very well-grounded economists, I beg your pardon, and can take the whole day talking economics and talking everything that is related to economics. Dear viewer, thanks for keeping it the equilibrium right from the beginning. I know it is such a hard task to sit on such a video and watch for that long and be able to reach the end of it. I'm very grateful on behalf of me as the host and the panel here and the whole entire Equilibrium crew that you've kept it the equilibrium, and keep checking our YouTube channel and subscribe so that you can get notifications to be able to catch these videos every Wednesday. Go to your phone, go to your computer, open up your YouTube every Wednesday. My name is Dan Ayevale, and all I can say for now is bye.